All right, okay, we're going to go ahead and look at chapter 17. We just finished chapter 16. If you did not get a chance to finish it in class, please finish. It's like a page and a half. It'll take you like 2 minutes to read it. And what I want you to get from chapter 16 was the way that Joanne tried to commit suicide. And then I also want you to see how it ends, right? One of the things that I want you to also to get from chapter 16 is how many people visit Esther. A lot of people visit her. She is loved, she is cared for, she is supported, but yet she fails to see that. So that's an important component of chapter 16. So do yourself a favor, go back and read the rest of the page or two that we have left. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start here with chapter 17. Okay. It says, "You're a lucky girl today. The young nurse cleared my breakfast tray away and left me wrapped in my white blanket, like a passenger taking the sea air on the deck of a ship." And so here we have our simile where she compares herself to a passenger, right? And this is very fitting to someone who is on a journey, right? Or someone who is going somewhere, someone who is going somewhere, and I'll put it here, somewhere new, right? A new place. And yes, it is a simile, and but I do think that this is also symbolic of Esther, her journey herself, right? And how she hopefully is going to a new place herself, right? And it can be a new physical place or a new place mentally, right? Which is what she's most concerned. She's most concerned over. Why am I lucky? Well, I'm not sure if you're supposed to know yet, but today you're moving to Belsize. The nurse looked at me expectantly. Belsize? I said, I can't go there. Why not? I'm not ready. I'm not well enough. Of course you're well enough. Don't worry, they wouldn't be moving you if you weren't well enough. After the nurse left, I tried to puzzle out this new move on Dr. Nolan's part. What was she trying to prove? I had not changed. Nothing had changed. And Belsize was the best house of all. From Belsize, people went back to work, and back to school, and back to their homes. Joanne would be at Belsize. Joanne with her physics books, and her golf clubs, and her badminton rackets, and her breathy voice. Joanne had walk privileges. Joanne had shopping privileges. Joanne had town privileges. I gathered all my news of Joanne into a little bitter heap, though I received it with surface gladness. Joanne was the beaming double of my old best self, specially designed to follow and torment me. So I love the way Sylvia Plath right here tells you, hey, you don't gotta look past it. Here it is. Joanne is my foil, right? And she tells you all the things that Joanne does, and she explains to you why she is her double. Makes sense? So let's write here in the margins, Esther is told she will be moving to Belsize. It seems like Belsize is a place that has more freedom, okay? A place with more, like she says, privileges, okay? It's the best house at the hospital, right? And we know that Esther here now is insisting that she's not the same in terms of, I'm not ready to go. I haven't gotten better. And so here what, basically, how can I put this? Well, okay, no spoilers. Let me continue, and then we'll go back to this. But yeah, remember. Okay, let me say it. You know how we have the whole mirror symbolism, like how it's symbolic of Esther never being able to see herself or recognize herself in the mirror. Well, Joanne is also a mirror for her. Yes, she is her foil. She is also a mirror. But Joanne, at this point, is the only mirror that Esther can see where she actually recognizes herself, her old self. And this is huge, right? Joanne's experiences and who Joanne is continue to serve Esther as a mirror to her own life, okay? And so whoever's talking about mirror in the bell jar, Joanne, even though she's not physically a mirror, she is a mirror to Esther. And she is the only mirror so far in the entire book that Esther has looked at and said, she was just like the old me. This is the only mirror that Esther looks at and says, I recognize myself in this mirror. Except it's Joanne, okay? All right, it says, Perhaps Joanne would be gone when I got to Belsize. At least at Belsize, I could forget about shock treatments. At Kaplan, a lot of the women had shock treatments. I could tell which ones they were, because they didn't get their breakfast trays with the rest of us. They had their shock treatments while we all ate breakfast in our rooms, and then they came into the lounge quiet and extinguished, led like children by the nurses, and ate their breakfast there. Each morning when I heard the nurse knock with my tray, an immense relief flooded through me because I knew I was out of danger for that day. I didn't see how Dr. Norlin could tell you when to sleep during a shock treatment if she never had a shock treatment herself. How did she know the person didn't just look as if he was asleep, while at the same time, inside, he was feeling the blue volts and the noise, right? So we can put here, Esther is terrified of, wait, why don't I know how to spell? Okay, of shock treatments. And we see that in this quote right here where she tells us that every time they knocked with her breakfast tray, she had an immense relief. And she had relief because she would not undergo shock treatment. Okay, so poor Esther, she is definitely traumatized. We can see that. It says, I didn't see how piano music sounded from the end of the hall. So here we have piano music sounded. We have auditory imagery, because you can hear the piano music. Now remember that this piano music sets a tone, okay, for this part of the book. At supper I sat quietly, listening to the chatter of the Belsize women. They were all fashionably dressed and carefully made up, and several of them were married. Some of them had been shopping downtown, and others had been out visiting friends, and all during supper they kept tossing back and forth these private jokes. Okay, so she is already at Belsize, is what we see here. Okay, and she says that the women were fashionably dressed, they were married, they were out visiting friends, and they had jokes going on, they would go shopping. And so we see here, it says, I'd call Jack, a woman named Dee Dee said, only I'm afraid he wouldn't be home. I know just where I would call him, though, and he'd be in all right. So I'm going to go ahead and write here. Actually, let me grab a Post-it. Do I have one? Yes, okay. I'm grabbing a Post-it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write here these characters, right? So this is a woman from Belsize. So we have Dee Dee first. It says, the short, spry, blonde woman at my table laughed. I almost had Dr. Loring where I wanted him today. She widened her starry blue eyes like a little doll. I wouldn't mind trading old Percy in for a new model. Right, and so we see the ladies are here talking. What are they talking about? They're talking about men. They're talking about the doctors. Very flirtatious. Okay. So very flirtatious conversation between these women. And it says, at the opposite end of the room, Joanne was wolfing her Spam and broiled tomato with great appetite. She seemed perfectly at home among these women and treated me coolly with a slight sneer, like a dim and inferior acquaintance. So here we have that other simile, and we see here that Joanne is treating Esther, it says, coolly with a slight sneer. Which is kind of funny because now Joanne feels like she's superior than Esther, and then Esther has anxiety about like what these other women are gonna think, what are the opinions of these ladies, and it's so funny how there's like a hierarchy in this asylum. Makes sense, like, you know, if you're at Kaplan, then you're a shock treatment girl, and if you're at Belsize, then you're better, right? You're a little bit more high class if you're at Belsize, and we can see even through Joanne's actions that she treats Esther that way. It says, I had gone to bed right after supper, but then I heard the piano music and pictured Joanne and Dee Dee and Lubelle, the blonde woman, and the rest of them. So we have Dee Dee, we have Joanne, and then we have Lubelle, right, which is a blonde woman, laughing and gossiping about me in the living room behind my back. They would be saying how awful it was to have people like me in Belsize, and that I should be in Weimar instead. I decided to put a lid on their nasty talk. Draping my blanket loosely around my shoulders like a stole, I wandered down from the hall toward the light and the gay noise. For the rest of the evening, I listened to Dee Dee thump out some of her own songs on the grand piano, while the other women sat around playing bridge and chatting just the way they would in a college dormitory, only most of them were 10 years over college age. So we see here that Dee Dee is singing with her piano. All right. It says, one of them, a great tall gray-haired woman with a booming bass voice named Miss Sauvage, had gone to Vassar. I could tell right away she was a society woman because she talked about nothing but debutantes. It seemed she had 2 or 3 daughters, and that year they were all going to be debutantes, only she had loused up their debutante party by signing herself into the asylum. So we have here a new woman, right? Her name, let's write it down, is Mrs. Sauvage. And we see here that she had 2 or 3 daughters, right? That she says here that they were all going to be debutantes, only they ended up not being because Miss Sauvage went into the asylum. Basically, debutantes is her debut, okay, basically, and I'll put it here, debut in like a fashion show of some sort, okay. Dee Dee had one song she called The Milkman, and everybody kept saying she ought to get it published. It would be a hit. That's very nice, I said in a conversational voice. Joanne was leaning on one corner of the piano and leafing through a new issue of some fashion magazines, and Dee Dee smiled up at her as if the two of them shared a secret. "Oh, Esther," Joanne said then, holding up the magazine. "Isn't this you?" Dee Dee stopped playing. "Let me see." She took the magazine, peered at the page Joanne pointed to, and then glanced back at me. "Oh, no," Dee Dee said. "Surely not." She looked at the magazine again, then at me. "Never." "Oh, but it is Esther. Isn't it, Esther?" Joanne said. Lubel and Miss Sauvage drifted over, and pretending I knew what it was all about, I moved to the piano with them. The magazine showed a girl in a strapless evening dress of fuzzy white stuff, grinning fit to split, with a whole lot of boys bending around her. The girl was holding a glass full of transparent drink and seemed to have her eyes fixed over my shoulder on something that stood behind me, a little to my left. A faint breath fanned the back of my neck. I wheeled round. Now, let me ask you a question, guys. Do you think that this was Esther in the magazine? Yes, it was, right? This picture that Joanne discovers of Esther was from her New York days, remember, in the Amazon? And it's so interesting because Joanne and the other women basically ask her, is this the picture? And Esther's like, no. It's like if she's ashamed in some sort of way. And she tells them, it's not me, basically. Again, going back to the same thing, Esther is unable to identify herself with that image, right, of the person that was in New York. She is unable to identify or even say, yes, that's me. For different reasons. She might be ashamed. She might not want other people to ask her questions. Or she might not want people to look at her in the magazine and say, wow, like that's how you were, and like, look at you now. This is where you ended up. Now, we noticed that Dee Dee was the one who basically said never. Like, that would never be her. There's no way that's her. Maybe because physically she's looking at Esther, and Esther doesn't look the same at all. Or maybe Dee Dee knew that it was her, but was just trying to be mean and tell her, basically, like, mock her by saying, no, like, that's not you. Like, you're one of us now, right? You can't be better than us. And we go back to that hierarchy in the asylum, right? How you have different houses in the asylum which have different types of women, right? And so we know we have the Kaplan, which is where all the women get the shock treatment, and then we have the Weimar, which is where Esther was for a while, right? And then now we have Belsize, okay, where we have the most fashionable women with more privileges. Make sense? So there was no way that they were going to bring someone into Belsize that was potentially better than them. There was no way that Dee Dee was going to accept that Esther, who was in a magazine, and now she's there with her. Like, she was not going to do that. And we can see that Esther, denied it. Let's continue. That night, the nurse had come in, unnoticed, on her soft rubber soles. No kidding. Is that really you? No, it's not me. Joanne's quite mistaken. It's somebody else. Oh, say it's you, Dee Dee cried, but I pretended I didn't hear her and turned away. And we can see how Dee Dee here basically continues to, mock her. Right? Like, go on. Admit that was you. Admit that this is who you've become. I stared at the flat poker faces of the kings and jacks and queens and listened to the nurse talking about her hard life. You ladies don't know what it is, holding down 2 jobs, she said. Nights I'm over here watching you. LaBelle giggled. Oh, we're good. We're the best of the lot, and you know it. Oh, you are all right, the nurse paused. The nurse passed around a packet of spearmint gum, then unfolded a pink strap from its tinfoil wrapper herself. You're all right. It's those boobies at that state place that worry me off my feet. Do you work in both places, then? I asked with sudden interest. You bet, the nurse gave me a straight look, and I could see she thought I had no business in Belsize at all. You wouldn't like it over there one bit, Lady Jane. I found it strange that the nurse should call me Lady Jane when she knew what my name was perfectly well. Why? I persisted. Oh, it's not a nice place like this. This is a regular country club. Over there, they've got nothing. No OT to talk to of, no walks. Why haven't they got walks? Not enough employees. The nurse gulped in a trig and LaBelle groaned. Believe me, ladies, when I collect enough do-re-mi to buy a car, I'm clearing out. Will you clear out of here too? Joanne wanted to know. You bet, only private cases from then on when I feel like it. But I stopped listening. I felt the nurse had been instructed to show me my alternatives. Either I got better, or I fell down, like a burning, then burnt-out star, from Belsize to Kaplan to Weimar, and finally, after Dr. Nolan and Miss Ginna had given me up, to the state place next door. I gathered my blanket around me and pushed back my chair. You cold? The nurse demanded rudely. Yes, I said, moving off down the hall. I'm frozen stiff. So we can see this, I'll say it's an awkward interaction between nurse and Esther. So it seems here like the nurse was trying to be, easygoing with the ladies, and she was talking to Dee Dee and Joanne and LaBelle. They were talking to the ladies and talking to them about how she has 2 jobs and how it's a struggle for her. And so she's playing, cards with them, and then she starts complaining about, her job at the state asylum, and Esther automatically, feels like the nurse potentially has been instructed to go in there and tell her these things about the state hospital as a sort of way of threatening her to either get better or she has to go back to the state asylum. And so basically, if anybody's doing an IOP on, for example, the public asylums, the private asylums, the difference between them, and how we basically see how they differ, because in one of them you can see these ladies with all these privileges, and then in another one, you can see how they're not even, helped when they're eating, or they take the food away from them so quick. And so for Esther, it's just one of those things where she can recognize where she belongs, and I don't think she feels that she doesn't belong in Belsize because of her mental illness, but I think because of her financial status, I feel like she doesn't feel she's worthy enough to be in Belsize. And it's super interesting how they, like I said, have hierarchies even in the asylum, right? You have like your middle class, you have your lower class, and you have your higher class, even in asylums, right? And that's crazy to think about. It says, I woke up warm and placid in my white cocoon. From across the hall came the early morning clatter of the maids in the kitchen preparing the breakfast trays. I heard the nurse knock on the door next to mine at the far end of the hall. I was beginning to resign myself. If I was going to fall, I would hang on to my small comforts, at least as long as I possibly could. The nurse rapped on my door, and without waiting for an answer, she breathed in. It was a new nurse. They were always changing. With a lean, sand-colored face and sandy hair and large freckles polka-dotting her bony nose, for some reason the sight of this nurse made me sick at heart. It was only as she strode across the room to snap up the green blind that I realized part of her strangeness came from being empty-handed. I opened my mouth to ask for my breakfast tray, but silenced myself immediately. The nurse would be mistaking me for somebody else. New nurses often did that. Somebody in Belsize must be having shock treatments unknown to me, and the nurse had, quite understandably, confused me with her. So we can see right here where we will write new nurse, walks in to Esther's room in the morning without a breakfast tray. Now remember what she told us at the beginning of the chapter. They usually did the shock treatments while everybody else ate breakfast, and that every time that she got her breakfast tray, she felt like this immense relief, like she was safe and away from danger for the day. So we can see here that she felt sick at heart, and it was because she was empty-handed. So she showed up without a breakfast tray, and Esther immediately knew that something was off. And I like the way that she tried to kind of excuse the nurse and said, well, you know, she's mistaking me for somebody else. She's new. That's why this is happening. Maybe there's somebody else in Belsize that is having shock treatments, and the nurse, quite understandably, she made a mistake. She confused me with her. So here, Esther is, you know, avoiding, right, this realization that unfortunately she is going to be getting shock treatments. And it says, I waited until the nurse had made her little circuit of my room, patting, straightening, arranging, and taking the next tray into La Belle, one door farther down the hall. Then I shoved my feet into my slippers, and I'm dragging my blanket with me, for the morning was bright, but very cold, and I crossed quickly to the kitchen. The pink uniformed maid was filling a row of blue china coffee pitchers from a great battered kettle on the stove. So what she did, she put her shoes on, and she went straight to the kitchen. I looked with love at the lineup of waiting trays. All I had to do was reach out and claim my tray, and the world would be perfectly normal. There's been a mistake, I told the maid, leaning over the counter and speaking in a low, confidential tone. The new nurse forgot to bring me in my breakfast tray today. I love the way she says that she was speaking in a low, confidential tone, right? So she was like still playing the part of like, hey, like she made a mistake, you know, trying to keep it confidential, like, hey, I'm not trying to get her in trouble, but she made a mistake. I managed a bright smile to show there were no hard feelings. What's the name? The kitchen lady told her. Greenwood. Esther Greenwood. Greenwood. The maid's warty index finger slid down the list of names of the patients in Belsize tacked upon the kitchen wall. Greenwood, no breakfast today. I caught the rim of the counter with both hands. She says, I caught the rim of the counter. So she held on to the rim of the counter, right? She felt at that moment she could have potentially collapsed, right? She was completely shocked at the fact that she was not getting breakfast. And she knew why. She knew what that meant. There must be a mistake. Are you sure it's Greenwood? Greenwood, the maid said decisively as the nurse came in. The nurse looked questioningly from me to the maid. Miss Greenwood wanted her tray, the maid said, avoiding my eyes. So the maid was telling the nurse. So basically she was tattletelling. She was like, Miss Greenwood wanted her tray. Oh, the nurse smiled at me. You'll be getting your tray later on this morning, Miss Greenwood. You, ... But I didn't wait to hear what the nurse said. I strode blindly out into the hall, not to my room, because that was where they would come to get me, but to the alcove, greatly inferior to the alcove at Kaplan, but an alcove nevertheless in a quiet corner of the hall, where Joanne and La Belle and Dee Dee and Miss Savage would not come. I curled up in the far corner of the alcove with a blanket over my head. It wasn't the shock treatment that struck me, so much as a bare-faced treachery of Dr. Nolan. So we see here that Esther wakes up and she's not served her breakfast tray, which terrifies her, right? As she knows that only patients that have a scheduled shock treatment don't get their breakfast tray. So basically, she goes to the kitchen terrified because she feels that she is in some way betrayed, right? She's furious at Dr. Nolan, who she has trust. She says has actually broken that trust, right? And so she goes basically and she hides, right? Now, Dr. Nolan turns out to be, or seemed to be, compassionate and sympathetic, and she was the psychiatrist that Esther needed, but unfortunately she does still have to go with the shock treatment, which is what Esther was hoping would never happen. Now, if you remember that the doctor did tell her, like, as soon as we go through Dr. Nolan said, when we do have to do a shock treatment, I will let you know, and I will put you to sleep. Let's continue. I liked Dr. Nolan. I loved her. I had given her my trust on a platter. and I told her everything, and she had promised me faithfully to warn me ahead of time if I ever had to have another shock treatment. If she had told me the night before, I would have lain awake all night, of course, full of dread and foreboding, but by morning I would have been composed and ready. I would have gone down the hall between the two nurses, past Dee Dee and Lubell and Mrs. Savage and Joanne with dignity, like a person coolly resigned to execution. Now here's the thing, this is what Esther's telling us. She's telling us that she would have accepted it. She would have been okay with it. That she would have stayed up all night, but that in the morning she would have gone through with it. Now, personally, I don't think that's true. I think what Esther would have probably done was try to commit suicide or try to run away or try to hurt herself in some sort of way. Remember she said that she saw that the kitchen had glasses, like cup glasses, and that she was going to store that away in her mind like a squirrel stores a nut. I honestly think if they would have told her, she would have found her way into the kitchen, got a cup of glass, and probably broke it and tried to kill herself. And I think Dr. Nolan knew that too, and that's why she didn't tell her. The nurse bent over me and called my name. I pulled away and crouched farther into the corner. The nurse disappeared. I knew she would return in a minute with 2 burly men attendants, and I knew that they would bear me, howling and hitting, past the smiling audience now gathered in the lounge. Dr. Nolan put her arm around me and hugged me like a mother. "You said you'd tell me," I shouted at her through the messy blanket. "But I am telling you. I've come especially early to tell you, and I'm taking you over myself." I peered at her through swollen lids. "Why didn't you tell me last night?" "I only thought it would keep you awake if it'd be known." "You said you would tell me." "Listen, Esther," Dr. Nolan said, "I'm going over with you. I'll be there the whole time, so everything will happen right, the way I promised. I'll be there when you wake up, and I'll bring you back again." I looked at her. She seemed very upset. I waited a minute, then I said, "Promise you'll be there." "I promise." Dr. Nolan took out a white handkerchief and wiped my face. Then she hooked her arm in my arm, like an old friend, and helped me up, and we started down the hall. My blanket tangled about my feet, so I let it drop. But Dr. Nolan didn't seem to notice. We passed Joanne coming out of her room, and I gave her a meaning, disdainful smile, and she ducked back and waited until we had gone by. Then Dr. Nolan unlocked a door at the end of the hall and led me down a flight of stairs into the mysterious basement corridors that linked in an elaborate network of tunnels and holes all the various buildings of the hospital. The walls were bright, white laboratory style with bald bulbs set at intervals in the black ceiling. Stretchers and wheelchairs were stranded here and there. I hung on to Dr. Nolan's arm like death, and every so often she gave me an encouraging squeeze. Finally, we stopped at a green door with electrotherapy printed on it in black letters. I held back and Dr. Nolan waited. Then I said, "Let's get it over with." And we went in. The only people in the waiting room beside Dr. Nolan and me were a pale man in an untidy maroon bathrobe and his accompanying nurse. So this pale man, had just also received the treatment. "Do you want to sit down?" Dr. Nolan pointed at a wooden bench, but my legs felt full of heaviness, and I thought how hard it would be to lift myself from a sitting position when the shock treatment people came in. "I'd rather stand," I told her. At last a tall, cadaverous woman in a white smock entered the room from an inner door. I thought that she would go up and take the man in the maroon bathrobe, as he was first, so I was surprised when she came towards me. "Good morning, Dr. Nolan," the woman said, putting her arm around my shoulders. "Is this Esther?" "Yes, Miss Hugh. Esther, this is Miss Hugh. She'll take good care of you. I've told her about you." I thought the woman must be 7 feet tall. She bent over me in a kind way, and I could see that her face, with the buck teeth protruding in the center, had at one time been badly pitted with acne. It looked like maps of craters on the moon. So we have another simile of Esther describing the nurse. "I think we can take you right away, Esther," Miss Huey said. "Mr. Anderson won't mind waiting. Will you, Mr. Anderson?" Mr. Anderson didn't say a word. So with Miss Huey's arm around my shoulder and Dr. Nolan following, I moved into the next room. Through the slits of my eyes, which I didn't dare open too far, in case the full view strike me dead, I saw the white bed with its white drum-tight sheet, and the machine behind the bed, and the masked person, I couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman, behind the machine, and other masked people nearby the bed on both sides. Mrs. Hugh helped me climb up and lie me down on my back. "Talk to me," I said. Mrs. Huey began to talk in a low, soothing voice, smoothing the lotion on my temples and fitting the small electric buttons on either side of my head. "You'll be perfectly all right. You won't feel a thing. You just bite down. And she said something on my tongue, and in a panic I bit down, and darkness wiped me out like a chalk on a blackboard. So we have our last simile, and here we see that she fell asleep. Okay. Now, we see here that Esther is able to experience shock treatment the way it's supposed to be, in its ideal form, rather than the way Dr. Gordon did it, right? And so Dr. Nordland does fulfill her promise, right? And her promise is that she is going to be there, and that she will put her to sleep so that she doesn't experience or get to feel anything, right? And so that's what we see here in chapter 16. We'll see, I'm sorry, this is chapter 17. We'll see what happens in chapter 18. We only have 3 more chapters left to go. Thank you.